Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That's right. So you'll notice that I took out the word top. And the reason is because there have been so many advances, and top 10 implies some kind of a ranking, which I made no attempt to do. I basically selected 10 that I thought were worth discussing and sharing with you today. This period of time is just incredibly active in terms of the research advances. The second thing I just want to say before I start is that I'm really more of a warm-up act than anything else today, okay? You're going to hear a lot more details from the other speakers, from Dr. Liu, Dr. Matsulonis, Dr. Kabili, and so on. All right, so these are my disclosures, which I'm required to present before any talk. You know, I used this slide last year as well, and I think it really is helpful for thinking about the different aspects of research that take place for ovarian cancer. And today, I'll share some advances related to some of the biology and how what the advances are made with regard to treatment. There have been quite a few. And then also survivorship disparities. Again, you're going to hear a lot more detail as we go along, but I'll just share some snapshots with you during this part. The first concept, again, most of you know this, but very important, is that ovarian cancer is really not one disease at all. It's many, many, many different diseases. Even at a very high level, if we look at just epithelial type of ovarian cancer, there are many different subtypes. And within epithelial cancers, vast majority, about 70% represent serous types of cancers. Now, as a part of our Moonshot program, the details of which I simply won't have time today to discuss, we're learning that even within high-grade serous type of cancer, there are enormous differences in terms of the genetic makeup and how these cancers can behave. Under the microscope, these cancers can look identical, and yet the way that patients respond to treatment, to chemotherapy, to other treatments, is so different. So what we did as a part of this effort is that there are three groups here. I'll try to point to both slides, but there are three groups here. We took samples from patients who had complete removal of cancer, and we took samples from patients where we simply would not have been able to remove all cancer. So we started with neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and they either had an excellent response, meaning most of the cancer shrunk away with just 3 to 4 cycles of treatment, and those where the cancer really didn't change much at all with chemotherapy. Within these cancers, then, we did a massive analysis of the genetic makeup of these cancers, the immune compartment, so the proteins, the RNA, DNA. This took about 3 years to complete. So it's been a very, very, very extensive set of work. And a lot of differences were identified. Again, in future meetings, I'll be able to go through more details, but today's purpose is just wanted to mention that there are indeed differences. So even within a cancer that looks the same, there are actually a lot of differences that exist. I'm going to share some studies with you that have come out recently that continue to teach us how the role of surgery continues to evolve. So the first part of that is a study that Dr. Nicole Fleming helped to lead here at MD Anderson, and that relates to personalizing approaches for women with ovarian cancer. Historically, as you know, we operated with a large incision on pretty much everyone. If you did that, in experienced gynecologic oncologists' hands, only about 1/3 of the times you could remove all visible cancer, and that's called R0 surgery. So we needed better approaches to personalize surgical care and take those women to surgery where you had a higher chance of being able to remove all cancer. So as a part of this kind of an algorithm, patients with advanced ovarian cancer underwent a laparoscopic assessment. Laparoscopy meaning two ports about the size of this kind of a pen, one through the belly button, one in the left upper belly. And then with a camera looking at 7 different areas within the belly and pelvis, each area given a score of 0 or 2. And if you add those scores up, those patients who had a score of less than 8, they went to upfront debulking surgery. And the likelihood at MD Anderson that we could remove all cancer, all visible cancer, approaching 90%. So indeed, it allowed us to personalize surgical care. For those patients who had a score of equal to or greater than 8, the chances that we would be able to remove all cancer was really quite low. So in that setting, they received neoadjuvant therapy and then went to surgery. And almost 3/4 of the times, we were able to remove all visible cancer at the time. Now, the reason this kind of a system is needed is that this is what's called a progression-free survival curve. So the time period is noted on this axis here, and then this is the what's called progression-free survival, meaning the time to proportion of women who had either progression or relapse of cancer. Okay? So if you look at the dark blue line, that's the progression-free survival curve for those who had complete removal of cancer up front. And then the dark red line is the progression-free survival for those who had chemotherapy up front and then surgery. The point simply being that the outcomes are not equivalent. Again, as I shared with you in the previous part, that we're looking at the genetic makeup and so on, but this is the reason why such a triage mechanism is really important and needed. Now, again, I'm going through these fairly quickly because I have to cover 10. So another very controversial topic was that if you get to surgery up front, are you better off removing a lot of the lymph nodes from around the big blood vessels and the pelvis or not? This was just sort of built into the dogma, meaning there were some groups that said, oh, you absolutely have to remove all the lymph nodes. Others said, well, you don't. So finally, a really formal study was done where women with newly diagnosed advanced ovarian cancer, so pretty large study, almost 650 patients, were randomized, meaning the doctors themselves didn't choose. So half the women went to where they removed a lot of lymph nodes, and these lymph nodes were not enlarged. They simply removed these thinking that it may add benefit. And the other half did not have the lymph nodes removed. There was absolutely no benefit to this kind of a lymphadenectomy. So do you see, even a negative study can be informative and can have a huge impact on taking care of women with ovarian cancer. So this is one of those studies that taught us that just doing a big lymph node removal really doesn't add much, and if anything, it just may add more side effects and complications and so on. Another study that should be out fairly soon, many of us believe that if patients have the cancer come back, that's platinum sensitive, meaning it came back, say, more than 6 months or a year or so out, many of us felt that doing another surgery at that time was a good thing, where you try to remove all visible cancer again. And there were a lot of what are called retrospective studies. People looked at their own data and said, okay, there might be benefit. So finally, a formal study was done. Again, a phase 3 randomized trial. A lot of patients took part in this trial, and they were randomized to either having surgery followed by chemotherapy or just chemotherapy alone. Again, really no benefit to doing surgery. Boy, this changed the way we think about this whole aspect, and many of us had to recalibrate our own thinking. Okay? But again, data is data. You have to go with what you learn, and in this setting, again, a study that didn't show benefit, but a very important study in that regard. Now I'm going to shift gears and tell you about some of the new treatments that have come out. And I'll especially focus on PARP inhibitors targeting the blood supply and one study related to immune therapy and some of the combinations. I find this a really instructive part of the slide. Over about a 35-year period of time, there were 9 FDA approvals from the 1970s up into the 2000s. All of these were chemotherapy-based. But just to show you how much the pace has accelerated, just within the last 5 years, there have been 9 additional FDA approvals, and all of them have been for biologically targeted therapies, not for just the old chemotherapy drugs and so on. Really an exciting time at the pace of FDA approvals and discovery. PARP inhibitors we talked briefly about last year. They are highly active, especially in patients who have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, either germline, meaning in all their cells, or even just in the tumor, what's called a somatic mutation. There's several PARP inhibitors now that are FDA approved. Okay? But specifically, some of the really, I think, important advances have been this particular trial. Again, a large-scale trial, a randomized trial, almost 400 patients who carried a BRCA1 or 2 mutation with newly diagnosed ovarian cancer. They completed their upfront treatment and had either a complete or partial clinical response after chemotherapy. They were randomized to receiving a PARP inhibitor or a placebo. Okay? This is one of the few times where placebo trials can be really quite important. Otherwise, we don't do placebo trials. This was just a massive benefit in terms of improvement of, again, that aspect that we talked about, the progression-free survival. The overall survival simply isn't even mature for this particular study. This was such an important study, it rapidly led to the FDA approval for using a PARP inhibitor in a maintenance setting after completing all the surgery, chemotherapy, and so on for women with a BRCA1 or 2 mutation. Number 6. There have been a number of drugs that have been developed for targeting the blood supply. So the blood supply is kind of like fuel for feeding tumor growth. And bevacizumab is a drug that now is approved for 3 different settings. We don't want to just stop there. We want to continue to do better and better. So based on work that was done at MD Anderson and at other places, a bispecific drug was developed. So this is an antibody. This is not a chemotherapy drug. So this is an antibody that targets what bevacizumab targets, meaning VEGF, or the vascular endothelial growth factor, and another target called DLL4, which is also important for blood supply to cancer. So basically what you're getting is 2 targets with 1 drug. Okay? Tough name to pronounce for this drug, bevacizumab. Okay. So this drug went into early clinical trials, just remarkable effects. So this is what's called a waterfall plot. So the green, where you see the bars pointing away from the middle here, that means the extent of benefit in terms of tumor reduction. Okay? And if it went in the other direction, in the red side, that means progression. Okay? In this trial, in patients with relapsed cancer, about 75% of women had clinical benefit from this drug along with paclitaxel chemotherapy. We haven't seen this extent of benefit that often at all. This was such an exciting finding that it's rapidly moving to that large type of a design, phase 3 type of a clinical trial. Now, PARP inhibitors, as I shared with you, mentioned earlier, have been incredibly active, but we want to continue to build. Dr. Machulonis and her colleague, Dr. Joyce Liu, led a trial where they used a PARP inhibitor along with another drug called cediranib. That was very exciting. It really was a major finding in terms of the combination being superior. This is another trial that just came out very recently, where this was a smaller, what's called a phase 2 trial, again randomized though, almost 100 patients with relapsed platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer who received a PARP inhibitor or PARP inhibitor combined with bevacizumab to target the blood supply. Again, a remarkable finding that there is a substantial benefit for improving progression-free survival. It's teaching us that the findings are consistent, that if you combine a PARP inhibitor with a drug that targets a blood supply, boy, they combine well, and it offers new opportunities for improving outcomes. Number 8, combining PARP inhibitor with an immune drug. These drugs, these immune drugs called checkpoint inhibitors, have just been a game changer for patients with melanoma, lung cancer, and some of the other cancers. But for women with high-grade serous type, that drug alone just wasn't that exciting. It just wasn't that active. However, if you combine it with a PARP inhibitor, so here niraparib, a PARP inhibitor combined with that checkpoint immune drug, 62 patients, 5% with complete response in a very difficult group of patients who have platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. Another 13% with partial response, 47% with stable disease. And very importantly, those who do respond, their responses tend to be quite durable, which is really an exciting finding. Very, very, very active area for additional drug development. Number 9, this I would call a preliminary finding, okay? That Dr. Tourager, so this was a study when she was at Harvard, and then she moved to Tampa. It's what's called an epidemiologic study, where you look at a group of women who were followed for a very long period of time. They took all kinds of histories on these women. They looked at those who developed ovarian cancer and what drugs they were taking, what drugs they weren't taking, and so on, and found that compared to those women who never took any type of aspirin, and if you compare those to who took aspirin, even after their diagnosis of cancer, they did better, to the tune of about a 30% improvement in their outcomes. Okay? The reason I would be cautious about this, so I would not advocate patients with ovarian cancer just to run out and start taking aspirin, okay? This, I would really tell you, is a preliminary finding, but it's an exciting finding, okay? It deserves to be looked at further, and if it holds true and if it's safe, then we should consider something like that. But again, some degree of caution, okay? Number 10, which I think is just an incredibly important area. Dr. Kabili is going to talk, I think, a lot more about this, which is addressing disparities in both care, but very importantly also in patient outcomes. One of our trainees has led this project where rather than just looking at one or two cancers, we looked systematically across all cancers. So this is truly a pan-cancer analysis. I highlighted with the red box patients with ovarian cancer, and the farther to this direction of this dotted line the data is, the worse the outcomes. So the point here being that those who are of African American background tend to have about 40% worse outcomes compared to those who are of European American background. Okay? This we saw identical findings in a separate data set as well. Okay? We're not stopping there. We want to understand the reasons for these kinds of disparities. Is it related to socioeconomic status? Is it related to environmental factors? Is it related to genetic or molecular factors? So we're really doing an all-out effort for a pan-cancer analysis, and portions of this we've reported, portions of this now are under review, and so on. The final slide under the same arena that I want to share with you, and Dr. Liu is obviously going to talk a lot more about genetic testing and its implications, is that there are groups of women and individuals overall in this country and elsewhere who simply don't have access to genetic testing or other aspects. This study just absolutely shocked me. They found that in medically underserved beneficiaries with breast or ovarian cancer, only 9% were tested for BRCA1 or 2 mutations. 5 states had a test rate of 0. No state exceeded a test rate of 25%. Obviously, there's room for improvement. Okay. Now, the final slide I'm going to finish off with is really a slide of hope, which is that I've been tracking this data on an annual basis for a long time. And this is the most recent update is through 2016. So are we making progress? All the stuff that we talk about and do, is it really having any kind of an impact? If you look at incidence of ovarian cancer on a per 100,000 basis, Since 2000 to 2016, it actually continues to decline. There isn't a singular reason for this. There are many reasons for this, and I think some of the speakers will talk about some of those in a bit more detail. It has to do with better recognition, prevention approaches, better treatment, so it's an all-out effort, okay? And the second bar that I put, or line that I put in teal color intentionally, is that if you look at prevalence, meaning women who are living with ovarian cancer in the United States, despite a falling incidence, continues to go up and up and up. Okay, and there was a major inflection point right here, which followed the FDA approval of bevacizumab. And my prediction is, I could be wrong, my prediction is we're going to see another inflection point in the next 5 years because of the approval of PARP inhibitors and other combinations and so on that are coming about. Thank you again for having me.